The Nexus Combat Academy floated in the void between three star systems, a monument to galactic cooperation and, more accurately, to galactic ego. Its crystalline spires housed the finest military minds from 4 to 7 species, each convinced that particular brand of evolutionary superiority would dominate the curriculum. The Zephyrians with their four-dimensional tactical processing. The Karate with their predatory instincts honed over millennia. The Vexi whose cybernetic implants could calculate trajectory vectors faster than most species could blink. And then there were the humans. Oh, the humans. Poor, disadvantaged, tragically limited humans with their single-threaded consciousness and laughably brief lifespans. The Academy admitted them out of diplomatic necessity rather than any real expectation of competence. After all, humanity had somehow stumbled into galactic society despite possessing all the natural advantages of a particularly slow-witted fruit fly. The kindest professors viewed them as mascots. The realistic ones saw them as walking examples of how not to evolve. Currently ranked 97th out of 100 cadets in her class, Cadet Reiko Tanaka embodied everything the galaxy found charmingly hopeless about her species. While her Zephyrian classmates absorbed 17 different combat manuals simultaneously, she struggled through one tactical primer with what could generously be called determination and more accurately described as pig-headed stubbornness. While the Karate Cub sparred with lethal precision, she got knocked unconscious by training dummies. While the Vexi calculated optimal formations in microseconds, she sat in the corner scribbling notes about something called guerrilla warfare from her species' primitive archives. The professors found her hobby endearing in the way one might find a pet's futile attempts to open doors endearing. Ancient human conflicts. How quaint. How irrelevant. The galaxy had moved beyond such crude methodology centuries before humanity had even discovered fire. Why study the tactical innovations of creatures who fought with chemical explosives and kinetic projectiles, when modern warfare involved manipulating space-time itself? Professor Velva, a distinguished Zephyrian whose tactical genius was legendary across 3 sectors, often used Tanaka as an example during lectures. Not a good example, obviously. More like a cautionary tale about what happened when evolution took a wrong turn somewhere around the development of opposable thumbs. Observe Cadet Tanaka's approach to the Kepler siege simulation, Velva would announce, his 4-dimensional vocal cords producing harmonics that roughly translated to barely concealed amusement. While her classmates properly calculated the optimal siege vectors using established protocols, she dug holes in the ground and waited. The class would ripple with laughter, or whatever passed for laughter among species whose emotional expressions ranged from chromatic shifts to controlled electromagnetic pulses. Tanaka would sit there, taking notes, seemingly oblivious to the mockery. She had that peculiar human quality of appearing completely unfazed by obvious social cues, which the galaxy found both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, because asking would have required admitting a human might know something they didn't, was that Tanaka's hole-digging had actually won the simulation. The Academy's computers had marked it as a statistical anomaly and moved on. After all, primitive tactics couldn't possibly succeed against properly calculated strategies. The fact that they had succeeded must have been a glitch in the simulation matrix. The Nexus Academy wasn't just an educational institution. It was a carefully orchestrated display of galactic superiority. Each species sent their finest specimens, their genetic cream rising to the top of a meritocracy, so pure it practically gleamed. The top-ranked cadets, beings like ZYXR the Karate Prodigy, Nim7 the Vex-High Tactical Genius, and Kethlon the Zephyrian Savant, represented the pinnacle of their respective evolutionary paths. And somewhere near the bottom, consistently outranked by a sentient crystal that communicated through mineral deposits, was Reiko Tanaka, humanity's accidentally adequate representative. The ranking system itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. Combat effectiveness, tactical innovation, strategic thinking, adaptive intelligence, leadership potential, all measured, quantified, and reduced to a single number that determined everything from meal privileges to dormitory assignments. The top 10 cadets dined on delicacies prepared by molecular gastronomists. The bottom 10 got nutrition paste that supposedly contained all essential vitamins but tasted like regret. Tanaka had grown quite familiar with the taste of regret. But she kept those notebooks. page after page of human military history, annotated with observations that would have seemed bizarre to her classmates if they'd bothered to look. Notes about something called asymmetric warfare and references to conflicts with names like Vietnam and Afghanistan. Primitive barbarism, obviously. The kind of crude thinking that explained why humanity had taken so long to achieve spaceflight. The galaxy's greatest military minds had designed the Academy to be a perfect closed system. Everything was calculated, measured, optimized. The facilities themselves were works of art, self-maintaining structures that adapted to any threat, energy barriers that could contain miniature stars, automated defenses that responded to danger faster than conscious thought. Which made it all the more embarrassing when they decided to store the Apex there. The Apex. Even the name carried weight across galactic civilization, spoken in the same tones reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. A bioweapon from the last great galactic war, engineered by a species so thoroughly extinct that even their name had been classified out of existence. The thing was essentially a living weapon of mass destruction, designed to adapt to any environment, overcome any defense, and eliminate any threat with a kind of ruthless efficiency that made evolution look lazy by comparison. Naturally, the galaxy's finest minds had decided it was completely safe to study. The reasoning was sound, they assured themselves during committee meetings that lasted longer than some civilizations. The Apex was contained in a facility designed by the most brilliant engineers from 17 species. It was guarded by defensive systems that existed partially outside normal spacetime. It was monitored by AI systems, so advanced they had developed their own philosophical schools of thought. And it was overseen by the finest military academy in known space, where the galaxy's future leaders could observe and learn from this relic of a more primitive time. What could possibly go wrong? The containment facility occupied the academy's lowest level, a feat of engineering that managed to be simultaneously the most secure location in the galaxy and the most convenient field trip destination for advanced tactical studies classes. The viewing chamber allowed students to observe the Apex through 17 different layers of reality, each one supposedly impermeable to anything the creature might attempt. The Apex itself was disappointing, really, about the size of a large human, covered in what looked like organic armor, and possessing the general demeanor of something that had been sleeping for several centuries and was getting quite tired of being poked at by alien teenagers. It moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but slowly, lazily, as if it had all the time in the universe to plan whatever it was planning. Which, given its current circumstances, it probably did. Professor Krental, the Academy's leading expert on xenobiology and extinct civilizations, gave regular lectures about the Apex's fascinating evolutionary adaptations. How it could regenerate from virtually any damage. How it could adapt to any environment within hours. How its combat programming made it the perfect warrior, capable of learning from every encounter and becoming deadlier with each engagement. The students would listen with a kind of polite attention reserved for subjects that were clearly irrelevant to their future careers. After all, the thing was locked up tighter than a karate bank vault. What were the odds of it ever becoming a practical concern? As it turned out, roughly the same as the odds of the Academy's brightest minds overlooking a single crucial detail in their otherwise perfect security system. The morning everything went sideways began like any other morning at the Nexus Academy. Cadets stumbled through their daily routines with the practiced efficiency of beings who had learned that military precision was the difference between success and nutrition paste. The artificial sunrise painted the Academy's corridors in shades of warm gold, a carefully calculated psychological effect designed to promote alertness and academic performance. Tanaka was in the library, naturally. While her classmates attended advanced multidimensional tactical theory or practical applications of quantum combat dynamics, she had a free period that she typically spent reading about something called irregular warfare. The librarian, a patient ethereal named Whisper, had long ago stopped trying to redirect her toward more appropriate material. The human section of the library was embarrassingly small, 3 shelves tucked between primitive agricultural techniques and pre-spaceflight archaeology. Most of it was diplomatic gifts, cultural exchanges that nobody had bothered to translate properly. But buried in the anthropological studies and tourist brochures were military histories that read like fantasy novels to the rest of the galaxy. Stories about farmers defeating professional armies. Accounts of inferior forces using terrain and tactics to overcome technologically superior enemies. Case studies in what happened when conventional wisdom met unconventional thinking. Primitive stuff, obviously. The kind of thinking that belonged in a museum rather than a modern military academy. Tanaka was deep in an account of something called the Battle of Thermopylae when the first alarm sounded. Not the gentle chime that indicated a schedule change or the melodic tone that summoned cadets to formation. This was the harsh, discordant wail that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. The sound that made every species' fight or flight reflex kick in simultaneously, creating a brief moment of pure, instinctual panic before training took over. Tanaka looked up from her reading just as the second alarm joined the feist, then a third, building into a symphony of impending disaster that made her teeth ache. Around her, other cadets were already moving, some toward designated emergency stations, others toward exits, all with the purposeful efficiency of beings who had drilled for this moment. She closed her book carefully, marking her place with a slip of paper that contained her notes about force multiplication and tactical flexibility. Then she stood up and walked toward the sound of screaming. The corridors were chaos. Not the organized, efficient chaos of a military response, but the raw, primal chaos of beings who had suddenly realized that their perfect system had failed them. The Academy's automated announcement system was broadcasting in 47 languages simultaneously, creating a babble of warnings that roughly translated to everyone panic. But please do so in an orderly fashion. Through the noise, Tanaka caught fragments of information. Containment breach. Level 7. All personnel evacuate. The apex was loose. She paused in a corridor junction, watching her classmates rush past in various states of controlled terror. ZYXR, the karate prodigy, was moving with predatory speed toward the nearest shuttle bay. NIM7, the Vex High genius, was calculating evacuation routes while running. KethLON, the Zephyrian savant, was simultaneously existing in 4 dimensions while fleeing in 3. The galaxy's finest military minds, the future leaders of interstellar civilization, were running away from the problem as fast as their various appendages could carry them. Tanaka pulled out her notebook and started walking toward Level 7. The Academy's design was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Each level was isolated from the others by security barriers that could theoretically contain a small supernova. The lifts wouldn't operate during a containment breach, forcing any potential escapees to navigate a maze of defensive positions and automated systems designed to stop anything short of a cosmic force. Unfortunately, the apex qualified as a cosmic force. Tanaka found the first bodies 3 levels up from containment. Not bodies, exactly. The apex was apparently too efficient for something as crude as corpses. Just empty armor and equipment scattered around with the kind of precision that suggested whoever had been wearing them had simply stopped existing. The Academy's defensive systems were still active, filling the corridors with energy barriers, automated turrets, and hunter-killer drones that moved with lethal grace. They were designed by the finest military engineers in the galaxy, programmed with tactical algorithms developed by species that had been waging war since before Earth had developed multicellular life. They were also completely useless. The apex moved through the Academy's defenses like they were elaborate art installations. Every barrier that should have been impermeable, every weapon that should have been unstoppable, every trap that should have been inescapable, it adapted to them, learned from them, incorporated their strengths into its own ever-evolving arsenal. Tanaka watched from a service corridor as the creature flowed around a plasma cannon emplacement, analyzed its firing pattern in the space between heartbeats, then destroyed it with a single gesture that somehow turned the weapon's own energy against itself. The apex wasn't just overcoming the Academy's defenses, it was making them look embarrassingly primitive in the process. Which was when she realized something that would have terrified her classmates if they'd been there to hear it. The apex was bored. This wasn't a desperate escape or a rampage of destruction. This was a casual stroll by something so far beyond the Academy's defensive measures that it barely registered them as obstacles. The creature that had terrified galactic civilization for centuries was treating the galaxy's most advanced military facility like a mildly interesting puzzle. That should have been terrifying. Instead, Tanaka found herself making notes. The apex's movement patterns were efficient but predictable. It took the most direct route to each objective, eliminating obstacles with minimal effort. Classic military doctrine, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The kind of approach that worked perfectly against conventional opponents, following conventional tactics. The kind of approach that had certain historical weaknesses. Tanaka closed her notebook and started moving. Not toward the evacuation points, where her classmates were undoubtedly arguing about optimal escape vectors. Not toward the communication arrays, where the professors were probably sending increasingly panicked messages to galactic authorities. She headed toward the maintenance levels, where the Academy kept the things too mundane for its sophisticated systems to bother with. The storage bay she remembered from her early explorations was still there, filled with the kind of basic supplies that modern technology had made obsolete. Chemical explosives for construction work. Kinetic weapons for training scenarios. Communication equipment that worked on simple radio frequencies instead of quantum entanglement. Primitive stuff. The kind of equipment that had no place in modern warfare. Tanaka started loading a maintenance cart with supplies, working with the methodical efficiency of someone following a plan that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. Chemical explosives went into one section, arranged with the kind of spacing patterns she'd read about in accounts of something called booby traps. Kinetic weapons went into another, along with ammunition that used simple physical projectiles instead of exotic energy configurations. And in the center of it all, she placed a simple radio transmitter set to broadcast on emergency frequencies. By the time she finished, she could hear the Apex moving through the upper levels, its progress marked by the systematic failure of defensive systems and the occasional scream cut short. At this rate, it would reach the Academy's primary systems within the hour. After that, it would have access to the shuttle bays, the communication arrays, and eventually the shipping lanes that connected the Academy to the rest of galactic civilization. The galaxy's most advanced military academy was about to become patient zero in what could be the Apex's return to active service. And the only thing standing between a bored cosmic horror and the rest of known space was a human cadet ranked 97th in her class. Tanaka activated the radio transmitter and started broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. This is Cadet Tanaka to any surviving personnel. If you're receiving this transmission, do not attempt to engage the Apex using conventional tactics. Repeat, conventional tactics will not work. The creature adapts to any direct confrontation. Alternative approach required. Rendezvous at the following coordinates if you wish to participate in an unconventional solution. She gave the location of a storage bay 2 levels up, then switched off the transmitter. Whether anyone would respond was irrelevant. The message itself was part of the plan. 15 minutes later, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the fluid, predatory movement of the Apex, but the hesitant shuffle of beings who weren't sure whether they were walking toward salvation or suicide. The first to arrive was Kekstar, a mid-ranked Vex High cadet, whose cybernetic implants flickered with nervous energy. Behind him came Renth, a karate female whose predatory instincts had been warring with her survival instincts since the containment breach began. Then Yilnoth, a Zephyrian whose 4-dimensional perception was currently focused entirely on 3-dimensional escape routes. None of them were top-ranked. None of them were the Academy's golden children or future leaders. They were the middle-of-the-pack cadets who had survived this long not through superior abilities, but through the kind of practical caution that kept beings alive in dangerous situations. You called for survivors, Kekstar said, his synthesized voice carrying undertones of doubt. What is your proposed solution to our current situation? Tanaka gestured to her improvised arsenal of primitive weapons and obsolete equipment. We're going to kill it. The silence that followed contained several varieties of disbelief and at least one species equivalent of nervous laughter. Cadet Tanaka, Renth said carefully, the Apex has just destroyed defensive systems designed by the finest military engineers in the galaxy. It has adapted to weapons that represent the pinnacle of our technological advancement. What makes you believe that primitive equipment will succeed where modern systems have failed? Because, Tanaka said, checking the action on a kinetic rifle that probably belonged in a museum, modern systems are designed to fight modern enemies. The Apex was created to overcome advanced technology, sophisticated tactics, and overwhelming firepower. It's a perfect counter to everything we've learned about warfare in the last 1,000 years. She shouldered the rifle, testing its weight and balance. Primitive design, mechanical action, chemical propellant. The kind of weapon that had been obsolete before most of her classmate species had achieved spaceflight. But it wasn't designed to fight wars that ended before it was created. The plan, such as it was, relied on several assumptions that would have been laughed out of any respectable tactical seminar. First, that the Apex's adaptive capabilities were focused on contemporary threats. Second, that its tactical programming prioritized efficiency over caution. Third, that something designed to be the ultimate warrior might have blind spots when it came to methods it considered beneath its notice. And fourth, that sometimes the best way to fight the future was with the past. They started with reconnaissance, using the Academy's own surveillance systems against their intended purpose. Instead of monitoring the Apex directly, they tracked the pattern of system failures that marked its passage. The creature was methodically working through the Academy's levels, eliminating defensive positions and gathering information about its environment. Classic search and destroy tactics, executed with inhuman precision. It's following standard assault protocols, Yilnoth observed, his four-dimensional perception allowing him to track the Apex's movement through multiple levels simultaneously. Direct approach, overwhelming force, systematic elimination of resistance. Of course it is, Tanaka muttered, studying the tactical display. It's the perfect warrior, remember? It uses perfect tactics. Which was exactly the problem with perfection. It became predictable. The Apex's route through the Academy followed textbook assault patterns, modified for the specific architecture of the facility. It prioritized targets based on strategic value, eliminated threats in order of danger level, and advanced with a kind of methodical efficiency that made it essentially unstoppable against any conventional defense. But conventional defense wasn't what Tanaka had in mind. "Renth, I need you to take position here," she said, indicating a junction on the tactical display. "Your job isn't to fight the Apex, it's to be seen by it. When it spots you, run. Lead it down this corridor toward the maintenance section." "You want me to serve as bait," the karate said flatly. "I want you to serve as an irritation. Something that doesn't belong in its tactical matrix. A target that shouldn't exist according to its understanding of proper military doctrine." Renth's expression suggested she found the distinction less than comforting. The next phase required Kekstar's cybernetic capabilities, specifically his ability to interface with the Academy's more primitive systems, the ones that had been installed as backups and then forgotten about when superior technology made them redundant. "Can you access the environmental controls for the lower levels?" Tanaka asked. "Not the main climate systems, the old mechanical ones that regulate air pressure and humidity." "Those systems are considered obsolete," Kekstar replied. "They haven't been maintained in years. The Academy's main environmental controls make them unnecessary." "Perfect. Can you create a pressure differential between levels? Something subtle that won't register on the main sensors." Kekstar's implants flickered as he accessed the forgotten systems. "Possible, but why would such a minor environmental change affect the Apex?" "Because," Tanaka said, loading chemical explosives into what had once been a maintenance drone, "it's going to be a lot more than minor by the time we're finished." The beauty of primitive tactics, she reflected, was that they didn't rely on sophisticated technology or advanced calculations. They relied on understanding your enemy's psychology, exploiting their assumptions, and using their strengths against them. The Apex was designed to be the perfect warrior, which meant it thought like a perfect warrior. It anticipated advanced tactics, sophisticated defenses, and intelligent opposition. It was prepared for anything the galaxy's finest military minds might devise. It was not prepared for a half-trained human cadet with a cart full of chemical explosives and a head full of primitive warfare tactics. The first trap was simple, almost embarrassingly so. A pressure mine placed in a corridor junction, triggered by weight sensors that had been salvaged from the Academy's training equipment. The kind of device that belonged in a historical exhibit, not a modern combat situation. The Apex detected it immediately, of course, analyzed the primitive triggering mechanism, calculated the explosive yield, and adapted its approach to neutralize the threat. It moved with the fluid grace of a predator, avoiding the trigger zone with contemptuous ease. Which put it exactly where Tanaka wanted it. The mine wasn't meant to harm the Apex, it was meant to make it think. To force it to adapt to a type of threat that didn't belong in its tactical matrix. While it was busy cataloging the primitive explosive device, it missed the real trap, a series of chemical charges placed throughout the corridor's support structure, designed not to explode but to burn. The Apex realized what was happening just as the charges ignited, filling the corridor with smoke that contained a carefully calculated mixture of chemical compounds. Nothing toxic. The creature's adaptive biology would have handled that easily. Instead, the smoke created a cloud of particles that interfered with electromagnetic sensors, infrared detection, and most forms of advanced surveillance. For the first time since its escape, the Apex found itself fighting blind. It adapted naturally. The creature's tactical programming shifted to compensate for reduced visibility, incorporating movement patterns designed for low-light environments and enhanced audio detection. Within seconds, it had adjusted to the new conditions and resumed its advance. Right into Rentha's crossfire. The karate cadet was positioned behind a barricade made from maintenance equipment, armed with a kinetic weapon that fired simple metal projectiles using chemical propellants. Primitive technology, decades behind the energy weapons that were standard throughout the galaxy, which meant the Apex had no experience defending against it. The creature took 3 hits before its adaptive capabilities kicked in, analyzing the incoming projectiles and developing countermeasures. By the 4th shot, it was deflecting bullets with casual efficiency. By the 6th, it was tracking the trajectory back to Rentha's position. Which was when Renth did exactly what she'd been told to do. She ran. Not toward an escape route or defensible position, but deeper into the Academy's maintenance levels, leading the Apex through a maze of corridors that had been designed for service access rather than tactical movement. Narrow passages, sharp turns, low ceilings, terrain that negated most of the creature's advantages and forced it to move according to someone else's parameters. The Apex followed, naturally. Its tactical programming identified Renth as the primary threat and adjusted its priorities accordingly. The creature moved through the maintenance corridors with predatory patience, adapting to the confined environment while systematically eliminating potential escape routes. It was so focused on its pursuit that it almost missed the real threat. Yilnath struck from a ventilation shaft, using his 4-dimensional perception to attack from an angle that didn't quite exist in normal space. The weapon he carried was even more primitive than Rentha's rifle, a simple blade made from sharpened metal, the kind of implement that belonged in a museum rather than a military engagement. The Apex deflected the attack easily, its adaptive armor hardening against the primitive weapon. But the strike served its intended purpose. It forced the creature to acknowledge another threat, to divide its attention between multiple targets using tactics that didn't match its expectations. For something designed to be the perfect warrior, confusion was a new experience. The running fight that followed would have been considered amateur by any respectable military academy. Cadets armed with primitive weapons, using tactics that violated every principle of modern warfare, engaging an opponent that outclassed them in every measurable way. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it was something the Apex had never encountered before, a war it didn't understand. Every adaptation the creature made was countered by something even more primitive. When it developed defenses against kinetic weapons, Tanaka switched to chemical explosives. When it adapted to chemical explosives, Kextau attacked with simple electromagnetic pulses generated by Jura-rigged equipment. When it countered the electromagnetic attacks, Yilnath struck with blades and blunt instruments that relied on nothing more sophisticated than applied physics. The Apex wasn't losing, that would have been impossible. But it wasn't winning either, which was something it had never experienced before. Each encounter forced it to adapt to increasingly primitive tactics, pulling its attention away from its primary objective and trapping it in a tactical maze that had no logical solution. Because there was no logic to it. The human approach to warfare, as filtered through accounts of conflicts that had been fought with chemical explosives and mechanical weapons, didn't follow the rules that governed modern military theory. It was chaos disguised as strategy, desperation masquerading as tactics. And it was working. The final confrontation took place in the Academy's main power core, a chamber filled with the kind of sophisticated energy systems that represented the pinnacle of galactic engineering. The Apex had finally broken free from a harassment campaign, adapting to primitive tactics sufficiently to resume its original mission. It found Tanaka waiting for it, standing among the power conduits with the casual confidence of someone who had planned for exactly this moment. "You're quite impressive," she said conversationally, as if addressing a fellow cadet rather than a cosmic horror. The perfect warrior, designed to overcome any threat, adapt to any situation, learn from any encounter. No wonder the galaxy was terrified of your creators. The Apex regarded her with something that might have been curiosity. In all its encounters since escaping containment, nothing had attempted to communicate with it. The creature had been treated as a force of nature, something to be fled from or fought against, but never engaged as an intelligence. But perfection has limitations, Tanaka continued, pulling out her notebook. It's predictable. It follows patterns. And patterns can be exploited. She opened the notebook to a page covered with diagrams and calculations, not the sophisticated tactical analyses that would have impressed her professors, but simple sketches and basic mathematics that looked like something a child might draw. Your creators designed you to fight the kind of war they understood. Advanced technology, sophisticated tactics, overwhelming firepower. You're the perfect counter to everything they could imagine their enemies might use against them. The Apex moved closer, its adaptive senses analyzing the primitive notebook, the simple diagrams, the basic calculations that seemed to have no tactical relevance. But they couldn't imagine this, Tanaka said, closing the notebook and placing it carefully on a nearby console. They couldn't imagine someone fighting a war with methods that were already obsolete when your creators were learning to make fire. The creature paused, its tactical programming struggling to categorize this new information. A threat that relied on obsolete methods, tactics that predated its adaptive matrix, approaches that fell outside its understanding of warfare. Which was when the power core exploded. Not the sophisticated chain reaction that should have occurred when someone tampered with galactic-level energy systems. Not the exotic matter cascade that would have resulted from applying advanced physics to the problem. Just a simple chemical explosion, triggered by primitive charges that Tanaka had been placing throughout their conversation. The kind of explosion that belonged in a historical archive, not a modern military facility. The Apex, designed to adapt to any threat from the present or future, had no defense against an attack from the past. The creature survived, naturally. Its adaptive capabilities were too sophisticated to be completely overcome by something as crude as chemical explosives. But the explosion damaged its tactical matrix, corrupted its threat assessment protocols, and introduced enough chaos into its systems that it took several crucial seconds to reorient itself. Which was exactly long enough for the Academy's automated systems to reactivate. The containment field that enveloped the Apex was the same sophisticated technology that had held it for centuries, powered by the same advanced energy sources, controlled by the same brilliant AI systems. Nothing had changed about the containment protocols. Except this time, the Apex was confused. Its adaptive capabilities were struggling to process the mixture of primitive and advanced threats, trying to develop countermeasures for tactics that didn't fit any recognizable pattern. The creature that had casually overcome the galaxy's finest defensive systems was now trapped by the same systems it had already defeated, because it was no longer thinking clearly enough to apply its previous solutions. Confusion, it turned out, was the Apex's one weakness. The aftermath was appropriately anticlimactic. Galactic authorities arrived within hours, their fleets bristling with exotic weaponry and manned by the finest tactical minds in known space. They found the Academy intact, the Apex contained, and a small group of mid-rank cadets sitting in the debris-filled corridors looking like they weren't quite sure what had just happened. The investigation that followed was thorough, professional, and ultimately unsatisfying. The official report concluded that the Apex's containment breach had been due to a cascading system failure, and its eventual recontainment had resulted from the timely intervention of the Academy's automated defensive protocols. The primitive tactics employed by the surviving cadets were noted as an interesting footnote, a reminder that sometimes obsolete methods could provide temporary delays against superior opponents. The report recommended updating the Academy's curriculum to include basic historical warfare studies, as a way to better understand the psychological factors that might affect combat effectiveness. Cadet Tanaka's role in the incident was acknowledged with appropriate recognition. She was commended for her quick thinking, her ability to organize survivors, and her innovative use of available resources. Her tactical approach was described as unconventional but effective under the specific circumstances. Her class ranking remained unchanged. Bureaucracy, after all, was eternal. The ranking system had been designed by the galaxy's finest administrative minds, tested under countless scenarios, and refined over decades of practical application. One anomalous incident, no matter how dramatic, wasn't sufficient grounds for revising an entire academic framework. Besides, the methods that had proven effective against the Apex were clearly primitive tactics with limited real-world application. Interesting from a historical perspective, perhaps useful in extremely specialized scenarios, but hardly the kind of advanced military theory that belonged in a modern curriculum. The galaxy's military academies did, however, quietly begin incorporating irregular warfare into their elective programs. Just as a curiosity, of course. A way for advanced students to understand how their primitive ancestors had fought before the development of proper military doctrine. And if some of those students began requesting access to historical archives, began studying conflicts with names like Stalingrad and Dien Bien Phu, began taking notes about something called asymmetric warfare, well, that was simply the sign of curious minds exploring the full breadth of military history. The fact that several species intelligence agencies had begun quietly recruiting humans for specialized tactical consultation was entirely coincidental. Tanaka returned to her studies with characteristic determination, continuing to struggle through the advanced coursework while maintaining her fascination with primitive warfare. Her professors still used her as an example during lectures, though the nature of those examples had subtly shifted. She was no longer the cautionary tale about evolutionary limitations, but rather the curious case study in how sometimes old solutions could be applied to new problems. Her notebooks grew thicker, filled with increasingly detailed analyses of conflicts that had ended before most of her classmates' civilizations had begun. She cross-referenced tactical innovations with their historical contexts, traced the evolution of military thinking across cultures that had never met, and developed what could charitably be called a comprehensive theory of how primitive methods might complement advanced technology. Her professors found it all quite fascinating, in the way that academic minds found any thorough exploration of irrelevant subject matter fascinating. They encouraged her research, provided access to additional archives, and occasionally invited her to present her findings to classes studying the historical development of military doctrine. None of them suggested that her methods might have practical applications beyond their historical interest. After all, the galaxy had moved beyond such primitive thinking centuries ago. Modern warfare was a sophisticated art, practiced by advanced civilizations using technology that made ancient conflicts look like children playing with sticks. But sometimes, late at night in the Academy's archives, Tanaka would find herself reading accounts of farmers who had defeated professional armies, of guerrilla fighters who had overcome technologically superior opponents, of desperate defenders who had held impossible positions through nothing more than stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And she would make notes about force multiplication, about tactical flexibility, about the advantages that came from being underestimated by enemies who thought they understood the rules of warfare. After all, the galaxy was a large place, filled with species who had spent centuries developing the perfect military doctrines. Sooner or later, someone would create the perfect counter to those doctrines, the ultimate warrior designed to overcome any advanced tactical system. When that happened, the galaxy would need someone who remembered how to fight wars that had ended before the future began. And Cadet Tanaka, ranked 97th in her class, would be ready.